Bianca Devins was just 18, a girl with a love for art and an online presence that made her feel seen. But to Brandon Clark, she was more than a teenager posting pictures. She was an obsession, a fantasy he believed he was entitled to control. And that obsession would lead to a crime so shocking it blurred the line between the digital world and deadly reality. Bianca Devins lived in two worlds. One was the small, quiet town where she went to school, walked through familiar streets, and tried to find her place among peers who never quite understood her. The other was the vast digital space that opened up every time she unlocked her phone. In that second world, she could become whoever she wanted. She could express herself without the weight of judgment that hung so heavily in the physical one. Her photos, tinged with teenage creativity, carried a certain moodiness that drew people in. Her words, though often brief, seemed to whisper more than they said. The internet became her stage, and she quickly gathered an audience that admired her from behind glowing screens. At first, it felt harmless. The comments from strangers complimenting her beauty or her style made her feel seen. Messages from people across the country made her feel less isolated. She was young and still discovering who she was, and the internet gave her the freedom to experiment. Every follower felt like a vote of confidence. Every like was a validation. But what Bianca didn't realize was that attention, even the kind that feels flattering, can also attract shadows. Hidden in the endless stream of notifications was a single pair of eyes, watching her more intently than the rest. Among her growing circle of online friends was someone who stood out, not because of kindness, but because of persistence. He never seemed to miss a post, never failed to comment, and always found a way to insert himself into her digital life. At first, Bianca considered him loyal, perhaps even sweet. It felt comforting to have someone so consistently present. In her mind, he was just another internet friend, one of many who came and went. But to him, Bianca was not just another girl online. She was an obsession, a living canvas onto which he projected his desires and fantasies. He collected pieces of her like a puzzle, her favorite songs, the way she styled her hair, the hours she stayed up late scrolling. The more he learned, the more he convinced himself that he knew her better than anyone else could. Each detail became a thread binding him tighter to his illusion. His admiration quickly shifted into something darker. He didn't want to simply know her, he wanted to own her, and ownership in his mind meant control. For Bianca, life carried on as normal. She shared photos, joined group chats, and continued to explore her identity in the digital world. But while she was focused on her own growth, her admirer was focused solely on her. He watched her interactions with others and grew restless. Each new friend she made felt like a threat. Each time she laughed with someone else online, it fueled his anger. To him, those weren't harmless connections, they were betrayals. His fixation began to twist, slowly reshaping his admiration into a dangerous obsession. In the quiet of her bedroom, Bianca remained blissfully unaware of just how deeply this stranger had latched onto her life. To her, the internet was a space of freedom. To him, it was a cage where he kept her locked inside his fantasy. And like many young people who grow up surrounded by technology, she underestimated how thin the barrier really was between the safety of the screen and the dangers waiting outside of it. While Bianca scrolled late at night, laughing at memes and responding to friends, the man on the other side of the screen sat in silence, watching, plotting, convincing himself that one day she would see him the way he saw her. For him, this wasn't simply an online crush, it was destiny. For Bianca, it was just another follower in a sea of names. But beneath the surface, in the shadows of her digital life, a storm was already beginning to form, one that would soon spill out of the virtual world and into her real one with devastating consequences. The man who had been watching, Bianca so closely believed he was different from the others who filled her inbox. He wasn't just another admirer leaving heart emojis or vague compliments. He considered himself her confidant, her safe place, the one who truly understood her struggles. When he messaged her, he poured out attention in long paragraphs, reminding her how special she was, how rare, how misunderstood by everyone else. For a teenager searching for validation, it felt flattering. It felt like maybe she had finally found someone who would never leave. Bianca responded in the way many young people do when met with constant attention. She answered occasionally, shared small details, and let the friendship grow. To her it was casual. To him it was a binding agreement. Every reply she gave him was stored away like evidence that they shared something sacred. Every time she let him into her thoughts, he believed it was a promise, and in his mind, promises could not be broken. The longer their messages went on, the more his expectations swelled. He tracked the hours she was online, noticed when she ignored him, and grew restless when she posted photos without acknowledging him. Each small slight fueled his resentment. He didn't see her as an independent young woman with her own life. He saw her as someone drifting away from him, someone who owed him loyalty. The imbalance between what she thought the relationship was and what he demanded from it widened with every passing week. Offline, Bianca's life was filled with the ordinary chaos of adolescence. She navigated the highs and lows of friendships, family tension, and the pressure of figuring out who she wanted to become. She still attended gatherings, explored new music, and stayed up too late scrolling through feeds. For her, the online space was only one part of a bigger picture, but for him, it was everything. He had little else to anchor himself, so he made Bianca his anchor. She became the sun around which his entire world revolved. As months went by, the tone of his messages shifted. At first, they were supportive, full of compliments, but slowly they turned possessive, then controlling. He questioned the people she spoke to, criticized the way she presented herself, and made passive-aggressive comments when she didn't respond quickly enough. He wanted to be the only one who mattered in her life, and when reality didn't match that fantasy, frustration boiled beneath his calm words. To Bianca, the change felt unsettling, but not alarming. She brushed it off as overprotectiveness, something she could manage by setting small boundaries. What she didn't realize was that boundaries only fed his obsession. Every time she pulled away, he tried harder to pull her back in. He studied her interactions, analyzed her likes and follows, and compared himself to the people she spent time with. He began to resent not only strangers online, but the friends and acquaintances who were part of her real life. In his mind, they were rivals. They were stealing what rightfully belonged to him. And the more he fed those thoughts, the more dangerous his attachment became. He started making subtle attempts to cross from the digital world into her physical one. He asked about her favorite places, her routines, the friends she spent time with. What felt like casual conversation to Bianca was in fact a careful collection of information. He was building a map of her life, step by step, until he could predict where she would be and when. To him, this was not stalking. It was preparation. He believed he was destined to meet her, destined to step out from behind the screen and prove he was the one who deserved her attention. Bianca remained unaware of just how far he was willing to go. She thought their connection was limited to the confines of a glowing screen. She had no idea that her online friend was already plotting a future where their roles would no longer be equal. To him, she was no longer a teenager with her own choices. She was an object of possession, a prize he intended to claim. And as his grip tightened in silence, Bianca's sense of safety was slowly being stripped away without her even knowing it. The summer night began like so many others, with the hum of cicadas in the distance and the faint glow of streetlights casting shadows on the pavement. Bianca had plans to unwind, to enjoy the warm air and the feeling of freedom that came with youth. She was unaware that every step she took, every movement she made, was being followed by someone whose life revolved entirely around her. For him, this night wasn't about relaxation or laughter. It was about finally turning his fantasy into reality. He had spent weeks rehearsing the moment in his mind. He envisioned what it would feel like to finally see her face without the glow of a phone screen, to hear her voice in the stillness of the night. But those rehearsals weren't innocent daydreams. They were meticulous, filled with plans and contingencies. He had memorized her schedule, the places she visited, and the friends she confided in. Every detail was a step toward this night, the night when he decided she would no longer exist as a separate person, but as something he could control completely. As Bianca laughed with friends, the danger crept closer. A car parked longer than usual down the street, unnoticed by most, but carrying a man whose obsession had festered too long. He watched her with a mixture of longing and rage. To him, her joy was unbearable, because it wasn't directed at him. The very sound of her laughter felt like betrayal. He believed she owed him her happiness, her time, her devotion. Seeing her live freely, without acknowledging his sacrifices, filled him with a storm of resentment. When the night grew quieter and the crowd began to thin, he seized his chance. The suburban street that had felt so open just hours earlier now seemed suffocating, the air thick with tension no one else could sense. Bianca felt a flicker of unease, that instinctive tightening in the chest when something isn't right. A figure emerged, familiar yet frightening, a face she recognized from countless online interactions, but never expected to see here, in the flesh. For the first time, the line between her digital life and her real one vanished, and standing before her was the proof that some boundaries should never have been crossed. He confronted her with an intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. In his mind, this was a reckoning, a moment when she would either acknowledge his devotion or pay the price for denying it. The charm he once wielded in messages was gone, replaced by a desperate anger that had been building in silence for months. To him, this wasn't a crime in the making. It was justice. It was the end of a story he believed she had written by ignoring him, by giving her attention to others. The confrontation escalated quickly, each second more volatile than the last. Bianca tried to reason, to understand, but there was no reasoning with a mind so poisoned by obsession. The suburban street, so ordinary and safe in daylight, became the stage for a violent act no one had imagined possible. His jealousy and rage, bottled up and nurtured in the dark corners of the internet, erupted in a moment of irreversible brutality. When silence finally returned to the street, it was the kind of silence that follows tragedy. The night air, once filled with laughter and movement, now hung heavy with the weight of what had happened. A young life, so full of promise, had been cut short not by chance or misfortune, but by the deliberate actions of someone who mistook obsession for love. The man who had once hidden behind a screen had stepped into reality, and in doing so, destroyed both hers and his forever. The storm he had carried within him for so long had finally broken, leaving behind devastation that would ripple far beyond that single night. Bianca's story, once told in filtered images and short posts, was now written in the most brutal of realities. What began as an online connection had ended in violence, proving that obsession doesn't stay confined to screens. It finds its way out, and when it does, the consequences are catastrophic. The morning after the crime, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Yellow tape cordoned off streets that only a day earlier had been filled with children riding bicycles and neighbors watering their lawns. Police vehicles lined the curbs, their flashing lights painting the quiet homes in red and blue. Residents whispered from behind curtains, peeking out in disbelief. The story that spread in fragments across the block was almost too horrifying to believe. Bianca Devins, the bright artistic teenager whose presence had been so alive only hours before, was gone. For investigators, the scene spoke volumes. It was not random. It was not the act of chance violence. It was personal, deliberate, and steeped in planning. They combed through her phone, tracing the digital threads of her life, and quickly uncovered a chilling reality. Her killer had left a breadcrumb trail in messages, posts, and online forums. He had been building a case in his own mind, writing his obsession into existence for anyone willing to look closely enough. Screenshots showed patterns of jealousy, comments dripping with entitlement, and long rants where he hinted at revenge if Bianca ever strayed too far from him. Detectives pieced together the timeline with grim efficiency. They saw how his fixation had grown, how he had isolated himself in order to pour every ounce of energy into following her digital footprint. The conversations that Bianca thought were casual had become his lifeline. When she made plans with friends, he tracked them. When she posted photos, he analyzed them for hidden meaning. And in the weeks leading up to her death, his words became darker, more erratic, as if he were preparing himself for the inevitable moment when fantasy would no longer be enough. The community, meanwhile, struggled to make sense of the tragedy. At her school, students gathered in hushed groups, many of them replaying memories of Bianca's laughter, her creative spark, the way she expressed herself without apology. To them, she had always seemed a little different, a little more daring than most. That difference, once admired, now carried the cruel weight of having drawn the attention of someone who saw it not as individuality, but as an invitation. Parents clutched their children tighter, suddenly fearful of the invisible dangers that lurked in the devices they had once freely handed them. The media descended quickly, amplifying the story to a national audience. Headlines captured the horror of a young girl's life cut short by online obsession, while television crews broadcast from the edge of the taped-off street. Strangers who had never met Bianca scrolled through her old posts, leaving messages of grief and disbelief. Her life, once shared in fragments on social media, was now dissected in its entirety. Every detail scrutinized for clues about what could have prevented her death. Law enforcement revealed more unsettling truths as the investigation deepened. The man responsible had not only fantasized about control, he had rehearsed it. His search history was littered with disturbing evidence, his online activity revealing months of preparation. The crime was not a sudden outburst, but the culmination of long calculated obsession. What shocked investigators most was how much of it had been hiding in plain sight. His disturbing posts, his cryptic warnings, and his increasingly unhinged behavior had gone unnoticed or dismissed by those around him. The realization spread quickly. Bianca's murder was not just the result of one person's fixation. It was a symptom of a larger problem. An online world where obsession can grow unchecked, where private fantasies are fueled by constant access, and where boundaries are easily blurred until they vanish altogether. Her tragedy forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about safety in the digital age. How many others were being watched so closely without knowing it? How many more were one step away from becoming a headline? As police carried away boxes of evidence and forensic teams documented every detail, the image of Bianca's short life became sharper in contrast to the violence of her end. Her artwork, her playlists, her journals, all small testaments to a life that should have stretched far beyond 18 years, were reminders of what had been stolen. And while the man responsible sat in custody, showing no remorse, the town around her grappled with grief that reached far beyond its borders. In the weeks that followed, Bianca's face appeared in news reports, on posters, and in countless social media tributes. But behind every photo was the same haunting truth. A young woman had been taken not by chance, but by a force that grew silently in the very space she thought was safe. Her story was no longer just her own. It was a warning carved out of tragedy about how obsession left unchecked can destroy not only a single life, but the sense of security in an entire community. The trial that followed Bianca's murder drew attention far beyond the quiet town where it happened. Courtrooms filled with reporters, community members, and grieving friends who wanted answers to the question that lingered in everyone's mind. How had an online obsession grown so powerful that it led to such violence? The man at the center of it sat with little expression, his demeanor unsettling in its lack of remorse. To him, this was the end of a story he believed had to be written. To the rest of the world, it was the senseless destruction of a young life. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with devastating clarity. They presented text messages filled with jealousy, online posts dripping with entitlement, and search histories that revealed his intentions long before the crime. They argued that this was not a sudden act of passion, but the result of months, even years, of obsession and planning. His online behavior painted a portrait of a man who confused control with love, who saw rejection not as a boundary, but as a challenge to his dominance. Family and friends of Bianca filled the courtroom with their quiet grief. They listened as her private life was dissected, her photos and messages turned into exhibits of evidence. For them, it was a double loss. Not only had Bianca's life been taken, but her memory was now bound to the details of her death. Still, they showed up every day, determined to honor her by bearing witness, by ensuring her story was heard in full. When the verdict finally came, it was a relief, but not a victory. The guilty ruling ensured that her killer would never walk freely again, but it could not return what had been stolen. No sentence could bring back Bianca's laughter, her artwork, her potential. The punishment was meant for justice, yet justice felt hollow compared to the magnitude of the loss. Outside the courtroom, her case sparked larger conversations that rippled across communities and media outlets. Parents began to monitor online activity more closely, not out of distrust, but out of fear of what might be hiding in the shadows. Schools held assemblies warning about the dangers of unchecked online relationships. Advocacy groups emerged, pushing for greater awareness of digital safety, encouraging young people to recognize red flags in interactions that might seem harmless at first. Bianca's name became more than a headline. It became a rallying cry for change. Her legacy lived on in the people who remembered her as more than a victim. They spoke of her creativity, how she sketched for hours and poured her feelings into her art. They recalled her kindness, the way she comforted friends who felt out of place, and how she always tried to see beauty in the world, even when it felt bleak. Those who knew her wanted the world to remember that she was more than the crime that took her. She was a person with dreams, with struggles, with a voice that deserved to echo far longer than it did. The tragedy forced a collective reckoning. It revealed how easy it is to confuse attention with affection, how quickly admiration can mutate into possession, and how dangerous it can be when boundaries are blurred in the digital age. Bianca's story reminded people that behind every username is a person with motives that may not be pure, that safety requires not just trust but vigilance. As time passed, murals were painted, vigils were held, and her family worked to create programs that would educate others about the risks she had unknowingly faced. They refused to let her name fade into silence. Instead, they transformed their grief into action, determined to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Bianca Devins' life was brief, but its impact stretched far beyond what she could have imagined. She became a symbol of the hidden dangers that lurk online, a reminder of how obsession can cross the boundary from screen to reality with catastrophic results. Her story, tragic and cautionary, continues to echo in the hearts of those who mourn her, and in the minds of those who seek to learn from it. In the end, her memory serves not only as a testament to what was lost, but as a warning of what must never be allowed to happen again.